when I verbalize it. How do I accept myself and the world? Everything affects me more than other people. I have a lack of hope for the future. I don't want to be angry dad. When I asked David why he decided to contact me, he answers, my previous Nashville couples and individual therapist was a passive listener, more of a relationship expert. This time I Googled existential therapist. I want to take a high-level view of how I'm perceiving the world. At the end of the first session, I gave David a copy of a chapter from Terrence Real's book, How Can I Get Through to You? Reconnecting Men and Women. This chapter is something I give to almost every patient I work with at some point in their treatment. Terrence Real describes how to develop an invisible psychic shield, which he calls an internal boundary, in order to not take what another person says or does personally. He presents this strategy as a kind of internal technology. Terrence Real writes, quote, the lack of an internal boundary inevitably leads to control or withdrawal. If there is no membrane between you and whatever external stimulus gets thrown at you, then you attempt to regulate your own level of comfort or discomfort by managing the stimulus. I could be happy if only you were less angry. When control fails, the only other option is withdrawal. At David's second session, 4 days later, he told me he'd read the internal boundary chapter and he said, I need a quieting of my mind. I need to spend less time being outraged. It's really easy to get me going. It never makes me feel better. My negative verbalizing about things I don't like. My wife is the main person who takes the brunt of this. With all new patients, I take a detailed history, usually beginning with the second session. In doing David's history, I learned that he looked up to his father and that his mother has become, in his words, more difficult to deal with. David's sister is narcissistic and her mother is a borderline. My mother is trending that way, he states, though she works really hard to fight against it. David describes his younger sister as making ill-advised decisions, but David says that his mother defends my sister to a fault. They remind me a lot of each other, not empathic of others. I can't say anything critical about my sister because my mother takes anything I say as personal offense. She's easily offended. I then asked David, how does he remember his mother when he was growing up? He responds, I don't remember her then as being a narcissist. I always ask patients what they know about each of their parents' childhoods. David states, my mother was the middle child and her mother was borderline and narcissistic, which was hard on my mother and her siblings, casual cruelty by their mother with biting criticism. This imbued in my mother a tendency to find distasteful things in others. My mother's family attack each other relentlessly behind their backs. I come from two lines of complainers in my family. My mother's also prone to depression. I inherit my depression and skepticism from her side. My father is disappointed that my mother is so petulant. After doing a parental history, I then always ask a new patient about their memories of childhood and adolescence. David talks about, quote, low-level bullying all through 5th grade. I wouldn't stand up for myself. In 7th grade, there were a lot of older, bigger kids. Some were mean and bullies. I hated school bus rides, bullying from the older and the high school kids, the fear and anxiety I felt. My birthday is in August, so I was always one of the youngest kids in my class. I was emotionally behind my peers all through life. I was more of a kid than others at these ages, not knowledgeable about the world. As I listen to this history, I'm thinking to myself about the severe impact that this bullying likely had on David's self-esteem. During David's junior year of college, he had his first debilitating bout of depression. He states to me, "Darkness came over me. By the end of college, I was a lost person, the guy I've been battling ever since, lost in the world, filled with anxiety, sadness, and hopelessness." After college, David took a job and became more and more depressed. He did seek out psychotherapy, but refused medication. He adds, "My anxiety and depression and not accepting sufficient help solidified my bad thought patterns." At the end of this second session, I suggested to David that I thought he would get a lot of help with his anger and resentment by listening to Pema Chodron's 3-CD set, Don't Bite the Hook. As many of you know, Pema Chodron is one of the world's most renowned and beloved Buddhist teachers. She resides at Gampo Abbey in Nova Scotia, the first Tibetan monastery for Westerners. She's an extraordinary teacher about thorny interpersonal problems like anger. Pema Chodron states, quote, "Someone criticizes you. They criticize your work or your appearance or your child. At moments like that, what do you feel?" The Tibetan word for this is shempa. It is usually translated attachment, but a more descriptive translation might be hooked. When shempa hooks us, we're likely to get stuck. At the subtlest level, we feel a tightening, a tensing, a sense of closing down. That's the hooked quality. That tight feeling has the power to hook us into self-denigration, blame, anger, jealousy, and other emotions which lead to words and actions that end up poisoning us. In his third session 10 days later, David told me that he had listened to Don't Bite the Hook and found it very useful. During this session, it became clearer to me that David has a virulent inner critic voice, that he struggles with tremendous underlying shame, and that his aloofness is, to a great extent, his effort to hide his shame from discovery. I explained to him this narcissistic dynamic, particularly true for men, of converting the painful emotion of shame into grandiosity, of going from less than to better than. During this session, I also introduced David to, quote, the trance of unworthiness, as described by Tara Brach, a Buddhist teacher and psychologist, in her book, Radical Acceptance, Embracing Your Heart with the Life of a Buddha. Tara Brach writes, as a friend of mine put it, feeling that something is wrong with me is the invisible and toxic gas I'm always breathing. When we experience our lives through this lens of personal insufficiency, we are imprisoned in what I call the trance of unworthiness. Trapped in this trance, we're unable to perceive the truth of who we really are. Tara Brach then describes an experience of one of her meditation students sitting at the bedside of the student's dying mother. Shortly before she dies, Tara Brach writes, the mother suddenly opened her eyes and looked clearly and intently at her daughter. You know, the mother whispered softly, all my life I thought something was wrong with me. Shaking her head slightly as if to say, what a waste. She closed her eyes and drifted back into a coma. Several hours later, she passed away. Tara Brach concludes, we don't have to wait until we're on our deathbed to realize what a waste of our precious lives it is to carry the belief that something is wrong with us. Yet because our habits of feeling insufficient are so strong, Awakening from the trance involves not only inner resolve, but also an active training of the heart and mind. This active training includes meditation and Buddhist teachings on non-judgment and self-compassion. During this third session, I also outlined to David Eckhart Tolle's concept of the pain body as described in Tolle's book, The Power of Now, A Guide to Spiritual Enlightenment. The pain body is Tolle's way of describing shame. Tolle vividly describes what I call a shame attack. He writes, watch out for any sign of unhappiness in yourself in whatever form. It may be the awakening pain body. Catch the pain body the moment it awakens from its dormant state. So the pain body, when it takes you over, creates a situation in your life that reflects back its own energy frequency for it to feed on. Pain can only feed on pain. You want to inflict pain or you want to suffer pain or both. However, the pain body is actually afraid of the light of your consciousness. It is afraid of being found out. So the pain body doesn't want you to observe it directly and see it for what it is. Because the moment you observe it, feel its energy within you and take your attention onto it, then the identification is broken. You've now become the witness or the watcher of the pain body. This means it cannot use you anymore by pretending to be you. It can no longer replenish itself through you. Having introduced these concepts to David in the first three sessions, I now begin to hear from him in his fourth session about his putting these concepts into practice in his own life. He states, I'm shocked at how effective I've been able to be at using these new skills. I've had plenty of opportunities to practice. Pema Chodron is wonderful in Don't Bite the Hook. I'm catching the anger. Here are the tools. I feel committed to using them, making this a daily thing, awakening to these things. I haven't realized the damage they've done to me. A grand project. I see another way to think and go forth in life. It's given me some hope for the future. I was unsure how I could relate to the world. Now I have a way I can process the things the world presents me with. David continues, I'm so wired for outrage. Before I couldn't stop and be with the feelings. That sticky feeling, Shempa, dead center in my chest. I feel the surge. By this point, I'd also introduced David to Pema Chodron's concept of, quote, dropping the storyline, meaning the story I'm going over and over in my head about how my partner has just said or done something that is so unkind, unfair, or unjust. As I keep going over these thoughts, running this storyline in my head, it keeps me stirred up and angry. David elaborates further. Dropping the storyline, physically feel it first. I have released its power over me. The realization that I have that power, it's really a big deal for me. I can't think of a time before that I was able to do that, trying to catch that rush right when it happens. I'm unexpectedly able to calm down. I'm able to not bite the hook. I can be in the middle of this swarm of things I don't like and not be reactive. I can name and get to know these feelings, but it is harder to do at home. Now I've been given the tools. It's up to me to create the practice and make it something permanent. Resisting that urge, Shempa, constantly pointing out Shempa to myself. There it is. It has a name. How powerful to name the feeling. I'm constantly bombarded with it. Now David begins to describe how others in his life may perceive the changes he is making. He says, it's a transition for me. People who know me well, they know how I've acted in the past. The incredible damage the anger does. People will have to forget the way I used to behave, and that will take time. I'm thinking about the emergence of the pain body. I see it as a purple blob, that pain awakening, that purple blob taking me over. I also like imagining a physical barrier for the internal boundary. I haven't had to take Xanax this week. These Buddhist concepts could change my mind enough to make it possible to not go down those old roads. In this fourth session, David also reveals the extent of his marijuana use. He says, I'm a very heavy marijuana user throughout the day, heavier than anyone I know. Perhaps I have a cannabis addiction, but it's such a fruitful one, and it's helpful for my mental state. It helps me come into the present moment. I've never told my psychiatrist I'm embarrassed about it. It seems like a dependence. I'm embarrassed to be a dependent drug user. I'm terrified he'd tell me to stop. It's scary to think about stopping. I've been a daily marijuana user since I was 20. When I'm bored, I use it to pass the time. It would be a good idea if I used it less. I then suggest to David that he has used marijuana in part to treat his depression. He responds, without a doubt, to augment my antidepressant. At the end of this fourth session, I suggest to David that he read Terrence Real's book, I Don't Want to Talk About It, The Secret Legacy of Male Depression. At some point in their treatment, I usually end up recommending this book to almost all my male patients. Terrence Real gives powerful vignettes of the exchanges that take place in his office between himself and the men he works with. I utilize so many of Terrence Real's concepts in my psychotherapy with men. These concepts include covert depression, which he describes as mild, elusive, and chronic. Also, performance-based self-esteem, the conversion of shame to grandiosity, and the importance of stopping addictive behaviors if any real psychotherapy is to take place. David begins his fifth session saying, these techniques of fighting off anger with awareness are helping at work. It's hardest at home, applying the same detachment to things my wife says or I want to say. It's a lot harder. These patterns my wife and I have established over the years. It's a lot harder to hold back the instantaneous flick of the switch and instead apply the internal boundary force field. It continues to be a challenge, but at work, I'm shocked at how effective it's been in controlling my social anxiety. David continues, I'm reading I Don't Want to Talk About It, about covert depression versus overt depression. I'm trying to become sensitive to the grandiosity I may be applying because of shame. Long-term, learning to slough off these patterns, a matter of practice, having an enthusiasm for changing my thoughts and patterns. It's exciting to be introduced to these concepts. I never understood their value until now. The enthusiasm for wanting real change, not temporary relief. This has given me some comfort in being in the world. I want to teach my children these concepts as young as they can understand. David adds, the mental illness in my family, I fear it being passed on to my children. I want to give them a new perspective. I want to help my children avoid their own quarter life or midlife crisis. I want to give them the tools to deal with it better than I did. I want to help them to avoid the internalization of shame, the sense I've had that the way I live is wrong. It's so hard to not care what other people think. When I was younger, it was so hard for me to genuinely not care. I'm realizing how this was created by me. I remember how hard it was. I worry about my happy children becoming these dark teenagers and not having a healthy mindset and feeling secure and having a place in the world. I want to make sure that I model this type of behavior. I'm trying to control my emotions with awareness and the cultivation of detachment. I'm not sure how to convey these lessons to my children. I hope that I can change myself enough to demonstrate to my kids. I have demonstrated my anger at home in the past. My 7-year-old, I will think she's repeating my wife's words. Daddy is getting mad again. I'm very annoyed by it. It makes me mad at my wife. A trigger, so hard not to follow. I don't want to be that dad. I don't want my 7-year-old to be aware that her father has a temper. It will take some training to change this dance. David continues, I'm reading a great article in the Buddhist magazine, The Lion's Roar. I want to be this way. I want to be a student of these concepts wherever that will lead me. I want to live in the world. There's no other way that I've seen without doing self-harm. I haven't had to take a Xanax in weeks. Before starting therapy, I had a week when I took a Xanax every day. By this point in his treatment, I'd also introduced David to the Buddhist concept of metta or loving kindness. I found this an immensely useful approach in assisting patients with reducing their virulent inner critic voices and substituting a practice of self-compassion, self-acceptance, and self-regard. I encourage patients to develop their own loving kindness phrases. I give them examples such as loving kindness and compassion towards myself. May I be free from suffering, free from ill will. May I be happy. May I love myself completely just as I am. 9 days later, David came for his 6th session. He began the session by stating, I've been very effective at controlling my opinions and attachments at work. I'm still having trouble at home in showing loving kindness to my wife and not becoming judgmental and angry. It's more difficult to not become attached at home. There are decisions to be made, picking up the kids, grocery shopping. When I'm away from home, my wife develops ways she'd like to do things. As an analytical person, I think I can improve on her decisions. I don't do a good job of adjusting my tone. My wife is still reeling from years of my having no concept of how I sound. She's used to the way I am, quick to react in a defensive way, which gets her going. Now I'm trying in the moment to just feel the anger and not act on it. At this point in the session, I introduced to David a saying by Sing Stan, the 3rd Zen patriarch, who states, do not search for the truth, only cease to cherish opinions. He doesn't say don't have opinions, he says only cease to cherish opinions. David responds, it's hard for me to let go of opinions. I'm good at logistics, figuring out a process. It's who I am as a person. I'm an organized person. I can figure out the best way to handle a situation. When I see a process that I deem inefficient, I'm constantly looking for ways to be efficient. At home, my wife will do some organizing. I won't think it's well organized, like in the kitchen. I immediately address the situation. I want to find the balance in letting go of my opinions and at the same time not being blown around the world by everybody's whims. There are times when a preference is called for. Buying a new car, I'd have very strong opinions about what kind of car or house. How do I square that with my letting go? It's a lot of money. My wife and I would both have really strong opinions about that. We don't like to waste money. To give up my opinion about that, an insurmountable challenge. At this point, I interject, we are looking for a better balance. David responds, I've been thinking about that, the various things you have to do. I add, we are looking for a different default position. Yes, David says, but other people I deal with are very assertive. If you don't have a strong stand, you will get run over. Then I say to David, we are looking for a default position that reflects better self-esteem. David responds, I'm still fighting off the shame pangs and grandiosity on a daily basis. People can pick up on your shempa even if you aren't saying anything. I utilize a grandiose way of subverting shame. I've been reading more from the book. I don't want to talk about it. The stories are illuminating. At this point in the session, we're working with the tension David feels between having strong opinions or being a doormat. I decided to share with him some reflections from Terence Real in his book, The New Rules of Marriage. Terence Real writes about, quote, why neither of the relationship strategies of the previous century, neither acquiescence nor personal empowerment, gets the results that women want. Instead, Real offers a model that he calls relationship empowerment. I share with David what Terence Real calls the 5 losing strategies in marriage. Number 1, needing to be right. Number 2, controlling your partner. Number 3, unbridled self-expression. Number 4, retaliation. And number 5, withdrawal. I elaborate for David what Terence Real says about needing to be right. Quote, instead of focusing on Elizabeth and her needs, the couple's debate centers on the burning question, which one of them was out of line. They each feel the need to be right, marshaling their evidence and arguing their case to lawyers before the court. Like many couples, they try to resolve their differences by eradicating them. Faced with contrasting views, the way to end the argument, they think, is to determine which version is the more accurate. They are in an objectivity battle. Instead of being a battle for the relationship, it's a constant war about who is right and who is wrong. Objective reality has no place in close personal relationships. I'll read that again. Objective reality has no place in close personal relationships. Real says, from a relationship savvy point of view, the only sensible answer to the question who's right and who's wrong is, who cares? You can be right or you can be married. What's more important to you? Letting go of the need to be right is a core principle of relationship empowerment. David then responds, I could become aware of, I think I'm right, and then just stop. Don't do anything. Keep the pain body from arising. I don't have to care about being right, but it's so much harder to apply in my marriage. If I could successfully let go of caring about being right, it would smooth out a lot of things. It would pretty much solve all 5 of those losing strategies. David continues, I feel really committed to the change right now. I think I could do it. I think it will be hard. I would rather not fight than be right. One of the biggest reliefs I've gotten from this training relates to my fear of the future, that my marriage will end because I will eventually become insufferable. I imagine the end of the marriage as my fault, me not being able to be a loving person. I've gotten some relief from these types of fears, realizing my emotional pain. I can choose to not ruminate. I can choose to stay here in the moment. I never believed I could do it. I don't know why it took me until I was in my 40s to realize this. It's just so simple when you realize that attachment is at the root of so many things. As I try to change, I hope to be a more loving person. Tell the people I love that I do love them. I'm so ingrained to staying closed and not expressing those types of things. Discomfort to imagine it, irrational discomfort. The idea of a very romantic gesture toward my wife, something I'm afraid to do, simply afraid of it for some reason. I then asked David if he has a guess as to why making a romantic gesture would feel so uncomfortable. He answers, an abstract thing in my brain judges me. My wife is such a warm, nice person. This fear, what would my friends say if they found out that I did something very romantic? If my buddies found out that I made a flowery, feminine expression of love? Before I had the tools to evaluate this way of thinking, that was something I couldn't face. Something about staying true to the person that people think I am over the years, an opinionated, emotionally unavailable person. That's who my family and friends see me as. I still feel some responsibility to live up to that person. I'm afraid to be a different person. I'm aware of that now. I wasn't before. Now that I've realized this, I can start to make changes and face the fear, simply feel it. It's a challenge, not defaulting to that person that I've been in the past. The past is controlling me. Some part of me likes being known as a tough person. I'm being a modern, tough person like I'm supposed to be. Society says it's okay, but it's not okay. It leads me to pain. I realize how hard I make my own life. Opinionated, a cantankerous old man, alone, driving everyone away, just hoping those around me would not abandon me as I continue to be a crank. It takes a lot of courage. I've got to be brave. I'm thinking they're going to be very surprised by this thing you're going to do. What does it feel like physically? The pain body arising. I've got a choice right now. I need to relax, stop having to be right, stay with my emotions, not ruminate. This hope that eventually becomes easier to express love and receive love. A week later, David came for his 7th session. He begins the session saying, I'm trying to catch myself. It's still hard at home. I've been able to knock the edge off it. Every now and then I've been successful. I felt the release and tried to not react. It's harder dealing with a subject where I think I'm right. Constantly trying to remind myself throughout the day to be mindful. When I'm driving around, these are very effective teachings to use in traffic. I want to call out the other drivers. I get close to an utterance, but I keep practicing. During this session, David recalled the period when he had returned home from college. He says, I had started into deep despair. I hated Christmas. It was a chance for people to figure out that I'm not doing anything. My own shame. They weren't persecuting me. It was a shame-filled period, absolute doldrums, an embarrassing period. I was a cold and arrogant person to my coworkers. I never cultivated any relationships, stagnation. I didn't know what to do with myself, a low point. I realized then I'm headed towards suicidal ideation. Eventually, David relocated to Nashville and met the woman who became his wife. He elaborates, I had no steady girlfriend before her. I never understood why. I wasn't outgoing. I was not really trying too hard. I wasn't compromising. A lot of my depression was based on the belief that I would never find a relationship, that that's how I'm supposed to live. My wife is the only person I've ever fallen in love with. She legitimized my entire existence. Maybe there's not something wrong with me. She gave me a great deal of hope. Such a supportive person she is. After they married, David was still depressed. He says, I was stuck in jobs I hated. I wasn't treating the depression at all. It was very cyclical. I'd go way down and then up again every few weeks. My wife told me, you have to explore treatment. I've been adamantly against taking any antidepressant. I told her, I don't want to be dependent on a drug. We ended up doing couples therapy, and I did some individual therapy, and I started Wellbutrin. Since being on it, I've been pretty free of overt depression. My brain chemistry evened out. Since starting this therapy with you, I now have tools, things I can do. In the work environment, it's easy. When I peel back the judgment, I've used the tools for everything that's come along that I'd have to take Xanax for in the past. In the past, I was scared. It was fight or flight. But there was no flight, so I would be in fighting mode. I'd ruminate all day. Now I've successfully not done that several times. Almost 3 weeks later, I met with David for his 8th session. He'd been out of town and said, the initial thrill of these new tools, I've had to challenge myself to be vigilant. A couple of times I've caught myself slipping back into that habitual pattern. I'm trying to stay inspired. I'm reading more in the book. I don't want to talk about it. A great book. It hits on so many things for me. Makes me realize that I need to talk in here about something I don't want to talk about, addiction. David continues. Terrence Real says that covertly depressed men will self-medicate because they don't feel anything. Putting yourself into a state so you will feel something. Exactly what's going on with me. I want to take steps to address this. I'm not getting a lot out of it. My tolerance. It doesn't accomplish my stated goal of being in the present moment. I do want to stop my daily marijuana use, but I've been doing this for years. I don't have the strength at this point to do it. I don't want to have a dramatic episode. Reading I don't want to talk about it makes me think about how I'm raising my son and my addiction. I've always known I'll have to change this, and I'm arriving at that point. What kind of dad do I want to be? No questions, it's an addiction. With alcohol, it's similar, but I don't like it as much. I don't happen to have the alcoholic gene, but with marijuana, I don't know if there's a way I can do this and not go cold turkey. I wish I could use it more responsibly, not depending on it. I'm looking for resources, ways to guide me through this. I'm ready to make a change. I'm not yet scared straight, but it's not sustainable. At this point, I asked David, how will you manage your boredom if you're not high? David answers, physical activity. I started playing golf with my coworkers a few years ago. Some of them also use a personal trainer. I opted out of that. I get enough exercise on my own and I eat healthy. It's a rebellion thing, setting myself apart. I don't care about my appearance. That's a dumb value. I could do yoga. That trainer's actually a pretty good yoga teacher. I then asked David, are you addressing your grandiosity? He responds, yes, I don't need to make this grandiose point that I don't care about my appearance. I have to break that. I'm prone to judge. I latch on to that. Self-defeating grandiosity, I ask. Yes, to me, I'm doing the noble thing, this lone warrior with honor. I won't fall prey. David continues, I'm trapped in my own prison, a cycle of my own making. Sounds like what in AA is called terminal uniqueness, I suggest. David responds, that's a great descriptive phrase. It takes two forms. I'm desperately wanting to be unique while also wanting to fit in and not be an outcast. My knee jerk is to do the opposite of what I'm really wanting. So you can be special, I ask. Yes, David answers. David returns to talking about the book. I don't want to talk about it. He says, performance-based self-esteem, that's the way I figured out how to feel I'm achieving whatever the standard is. Hard to come off that competitive performance-based aspect. But I don't want my self-esteem to be based on my last performance or if it's better than the others. It's a challenge to break that way of thinking. Mindfulness, I want to use it to break out of the judgment. My life's been built around performance-based self-esteem. That's so far from enlightenment. I have to work to eventually get out of that mindset. It always has stood in my way, my own judgment. Clearly, I have enough skills. Then I ask, being good enough isn't an acceptable category? David answers, I have to be the best, not good enough. But I'm so far from the best. Perfectionism, the shame wrapped up in it. I'm so wrapped up in my insecurity. It has cost me. The grandiose thing I do is say, I don't care about this. So you do the opposite, I ask? David responds, I'm shameful about how much I can do, but I act like I really don't care to throw everybody off the track. This attachment I've struggled with for a long time. Status anxiety, really suffering with that. I've never been able to step back from the grandiosity long enough to be a person who works on this. Without grandiosity or shame, I ask? David immediately responds, it's all grandiosity or shame. I entitled this talk, Healing Narcissistic Wounds and Learning to Love. I see these two as central long-term goals in much of the psychotherapy that we do. I hope this case demonstrates David's sincere and daily efforts to heal his deep narcissistic wounds and learn to love himself and his wife and children more deeply. I'd like to close with some profound words about the difficulty of learning to love from Thomas Merton, a Trappist monk who lived for almost 30 years at the Abbey of Gethsemane in Kentucky. Thomas Merton is known for having built a bridge between mystical Catholicism and Buddhism in his writing and in his dialogues with such Buddhists as the Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh. One of my favorites of Merton's many books is titled The Wisdom of the Desert. It is about the words of the Desert Fathers who were monks who lived in caves in Palestine in the 4th century. In his introduction to their words, Merton writes, love takes one's neighbor as one's other self and loves him with all the immense humility and discretion and reserve and reverence without which no one can presume to enter into the sanctuary of another's subjectivity. From such love, all authoritarian brutality, all exploitation, domineering, and condescension must necessarily be absent. The charity of the Desert Fathers is not set before us in unconvincing effusions. The full difficulty and magnitude of the task of loving others is recognized everywhere and never minimized. It is hard to really love others if love is to be taken in the full sense of the word. Love demands a complete inner transformation. For without this, we cannot possibly come to identify ourselves with the other. We have to become, in some sense, the person we love. And this involves a kind of death of our own being, our own self. No matter how hard we try, we resist this death. We fight back with anger, with recriminations, with demands, with ultimatums. We seek any convenient excuse to break off and give up the difficult task. Thank you.
All right. Wow. Well, that was wonderful. Thank you for that.
Thank you, John.
Does anyone have any questions or comments or let's see if we got anything here in the chat. Okay. Anyone have anything that they want to ask Phil before we break? Okay. Phil, thank you again for speaking to us today. It's always a pleasure. And everyone else, I'm so looking forward to when we can all meet again in person. Boy, I'm counting the minutes. Thank you for such a wonderful turnout today. And I guess we'll see you next time. Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks, John. Bye, everybody.
The rest of the day.
You too.
Bye now.
Bye.